welcome to Romance Studies 202, Modernism to the Present. Today, it is a real delight to have with me Professor Anita Traninger, who is Professor of Romance Studies and Deputy Director at the Institute for Romance Philology at the Freie Universität in Berlin. She's the author of many articles and books about the history of knowledge, about rhetoric. She works also on the archaeology of the digital, and a couple of years ago she won the Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz Prize, and in the citation she was described as one of the key international figures in Romance studies in a global context. So it's really a delight. Thank you so much for your time to talk to us about Romance studies as a discipline. And my first question, therefore, is how would you define what is Romance studies?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to connect across continents. I'm in a department that's called Romance Philology, above all. But the general term in German is Romanistik, which translates basically as Romance studies. This is our traditional form of organizing the study of the Romance languages, and it's mostly French, Italian, Spanish, plus Catalan, Romanian, Portuguese. So this would be the main languages studied in this field. It has a long tradition in Germany, and we used to be actually studying at least two of those languages in our courses of study. This has changed, though, in the early 2000s. And now I think we follow more or less the US model of having like Spanish or French or Italian. The curious thing about it is, though, that if you aspire to become a professor in the field, you're still required to have at least two of those languages. So our courses of study are a bit mismatched with what the academic career is. And this is, I think, not an easy thing to handle for young scholars, of course, because, I mean, how do you get the qualification? But also in terms of how we imagine our field and how we imagine it to grow and where we want to go with it. So this is Romance philology or Romanistic in Germany, where we are at the moment. But at the time being, professors in the department still have this idea of Romance studies as a unified field that treats of the literatures and languages, I should stress that, because we do literary studies and linguistics together in these languages and in these cultures.
So yes, to some extent, one might say that Romance studies, again, that's not the term that is used, is Romance philology, is an invention of the German-speaking world of Germany and
It
Austria and
is.
so on, and with a distinguished
It is.
tradition going back at least to the end of the 19th century.
Mhm.
I wonder if you could say a little bit about the sort of historical genesis of the field of Romance studies, and again a little bit more about how that might be changing today.
Well, it has changed a lot because, of course, the founding figures of the field in the 19th and early 20th century, they are still referred to as the great Romanists, right? So these were influential people like Erich Auerbach, who is well known, I think, in the US, or Leo Spitzer among them. They were concerned with the historical development of the languages from the Latin into the vernaculars, and they were incredibly well-read and universal scholars. This has changed quite a bit because, of course, this anchoring in the Latin and this whole, like Latin as a connective tissue of the field, I think it's long gone. Not for me personally, because I work a lot with Latin sources. We can talk about that later, why I do that. But I think this is long gone. So but still, Romance philology has been an important field also in terms of thinking about theory. You remember literary theory coming up as a big topic in the 1980s, and the Romance studies field was one of the leading fields actually in Germany in taking up French theory, of course. I mean, we were predestined to do that, yeah, as you can easily imagine, and push this further. So it was always or has been a quite an innovative discipline. I think it still is. And of course, as I said, it is changing with the courses of study being transformed under the Bologna model, which is our general educational model in Europe, with these individual courses of study in Spanish and French and Italian. So it has changed a lot, but I still see that a lot of the most interesting and exceptional work is produced in this field,
And
in literary studies and
you
linguistics as well.
you stress the relationship between literature and language in
Yeah,
Romance studies. Obviously, philology, one of the origins, perhaps, or one
sure.
strand in philology,
Yeah.
is the love of words
Yeah.
and looking at language development. Um,
Yeah.
although you're saying that perhaps these days that connection is being broken a little bit.
I mean, it is different. I mean, of course, language, the study of languages as such and language proficiency has become more important. I mean, many of the old great Romanists, they were not that proficient in all the languages they were able to study. Today, of course, we train our students, they are trained by native speakers to become really proficient in the languages. So this has changed quite a bit. Also, I would say that the philology label sounds a bit outdated in some ears today. But to me, of course, it involves the materiality of literature. If we think about philology as, tracing texts to their material origins in manuscripts, in old printed books, I think this is an eminently contemporary concern. The materiality of literature and in general material studies has, gained a lot of weight in the humanities, and I feel that our philological approach fits right with this development. So it has changed, but I do see that it's not always for the worse that it has changed.
And again, back to what you were saying about the founding figures in the field,
Mm,
people like Auerbach, for instance.
mm.
He writes, as you know, of course, this book called Mimesis, which is one of the, I don't know, classic works of comparative literature,
Of course.
an attempt to think about narrative in the Western world. He begins there, however, he doesn't begin with the Romance. He begins with the Greeks. And obviously, Greek is not a Romance language. I wonder how much the borders of Romance studies in Germany or elsewhere are patrolled, as it were,
Mhm,
right? In other words,
mhm.
that seemed to be interesting as in this sort of founding text, key text, classic text of Romance
Yeah,
studies. Auerbach goes beyond those borders
sure.
of Romance studies.
Auerbach is, of course, well versed in the classical tradition, and so Greek, together with Roman Latin, so Roman culture, forms the basis for this whole idea of a European intellectual tradition that is manifest in the Romance languages and literatures. So it doesn't really come as a surprise that he does that, and still, reaching back to the classics, to the Latin classics, to the Greek classics is quite. Um, Maybe common is not the right word, but it's something that you can easily do within Romance studies. But English and German, that's a border that's much more policed. I
Mhm.
should say on the positive side that, of course, if you do work in the field of Romance studies, you already deal with a couple of languages. So it's actually as you mentioned, comparative literature. So I would say that Romance studies is the original comparative literature. This is, I think, undeniable that it already has this comparative aspect between these literatures and the classical tradition. But it's not all that common to branch out to English language literature, not just the UK, but the American, of course, as well, or German. This is not done as much, but it does exist, of course. It does exist. But as humanities disciplines, and I think this is true worldwide, are under threat. I think policing borders is a kind of an instinctual reaction to being under threat, and it's not the most beneficial and not the most intellectually worthwhile reaction, I think.
So thinking about policing borders,
Yeah.
other kinds of borders, perhaps, not just disciplinary borders, or the way those map on to, well, national borders, obviously, because we're
Mm,
talking about, in many cases, national languages. If we're talking about French and
sure.
Spanish and Italian,
Sure.
Catalan's a more interesting case, perhaps. Um, what are the politics of, well, first of all, the politics perhaps of studying Romance languages in Germany, so studying French,
Mm,
perhaps particularly, and you were talking about the other French influences, the theoretical influences in Romance studies. So that's one notion, sort of border crossing. And then also, I guess
mm,
the Europe versus the rest of the world, right? Because there's a
mm.
way in which Romance studies traditionally perhaps was about a sense of a common European heritage. But of course, the last few decades, there's been increasing attention to other places where Romance languages are spoken, Latin America or
Yeah.
Africa, and so on and so forth.
I mean, we work on Latin America and Africa increasingly. So this has become a mainstay in our curricula and the syllabus. We also have much more research that combines perspectives from within and outside Europe. So this is definitely a change that has taken place. Studying French in Germany. I mean, if you do Roman studies as a field, it comes with a certain deterritorialization
Hmm.
because you're not a native speaker. I mean, you can be one in one of the languages, but you can't be a native speaker of Romance, right?
Hmm.
So, which this can be described as a, deficiency. You could say, what are these people doing? They're not even native speakers. But to me, this is actually quite a valuable perspective. It marks Roman studies as a discipline, kind of the in-between, right?
Hmm.
It's a connective discipline. It's about a networked idea of literature, an entangled idea of literature. So I feel this being kind of outside the national literature paradigm and outside the native speaker proficiency is actually quite a valuable point of view in literary studies.
No, I agree very much. I studied, for what it's worth, I studied English in England to start off with as an undergraduate.
Right.
And in England,
Mm.
English very much meant England. We had one optional paper in American literature, and that was seen as foreign and
Yeah.
strange, even though it's obviously in English. And you have obviously national figures like Shakespeare in English and Cervantes in Spanish and Goethe in, I
Mm.
presume, in German. And
Yeah.
yes, Romance studies, I like that idea of it as deterritorializing, as or connective, as you put it. I wonder, do you think uh, the question of connections then raises the question of whether there really is a commonality between what happens to be written in French, what happens to be written in Spanish, what happens to be written in Italian, and so on. What do you
Yeah.
think? What do you think brings together those literatures and those cultures, perhaps, or
Mm.
is that to what extent is that an artificial product of Romance
Hmm.
studies of seeing the
Yeah.
field in that way?
Of course, a discipline always shapes its object. I mean,
Yeah.
this is undeniable. But I mean, you could make 2 points for a connection between these literatures and languages. One is, of course, that all these vernaculars have developed from the Latin. This is the common explanation of Romance, so that all these languages are somehow derivative of the Latinate culture of the late Middle Ages, early Middle Ages, I'm sorry. But I think this is not the most interesting explanation. What is much more interesting to me is, I mean, and I'm an early modernist, so I work from the Renaissance to up to the 19th century, more or less. What I do see is that there was a Latinate culture, literary culture in Europe that was very much alive. The République des Lettres was very much alive long after Latin has vanished or had vanished as a spoken language. So it was a again it was a culture without any native speakers. So everybody wrote to each other and conversed in Latin, and humanist Latin, very difficult. And these literatures that emerged in the vernaculars, they were closely entwined with this Latin culture. So we have we have correspondences, we have dialogues, we have also rivalries that emerged not in a kind of a linear trajectory, but again in a kind of an entangled web of connections that I think is still present in a subterranean way in how not just these literatures, literature in general hangs together. But of course, I mean, if we look at, for example, the relations between Spain and France, I mean, there you have it. You could, in each century, you can find incredibly interesting and deep and polemical connections that inform, you know, seminal texts in these literatures. Same is true with Italy and Spain. So I think there's this whole world of a notion of literature that meant actually, being a kind of a learned citizen and being in contact with other learned citizens. This was what literature meant before 1750. So this, I think, is a kind of a foundation for looking at these literatures together today.
That's fascinating. There's a tension though, isn't there,
Sure.
between sort of Latin as a refuge, as a cosmopolitan refuge, perhaps. I don't know if that's not
Yes.
quite what you were saying, but
Yes.
I'm thinking of Spinoza, for instance, right? An Iberian Marano living in Amsterdam,
Sure.
so thrown out of the synagogue. So who writes in Latin? Who writes the but as a lingua franca, as it were, right?
Sure.
As part of his contribution to a knowledge that goes beyond borders
Exactly.
on the one hand, and I think that's fascinating. On the other hand, obviously, there's a kind of tension between Latin and a Latinate culture and intellectual and the demotic, right?
Of
Between
course.
people speaking French and Spanish and so on, let alone those people speaking so-called dialects, right? What
Sure.
become or French and Italian
Sure.
and Spanish and so on. I wonder if
Sure.
you could say more about that. That seems to be a tension, perhaps, at the heart of Romance studies.
Of course, there's a tension, and of course, people, made their own lives very difficult by adopting, a humanist classical idea of Latin. So the standard was pretty high, and they were really afraid of, speaking and writing in Latin. But it was a productive tension. And people were code switching all the time. Even people who are, considered as being not learned, like Lope de Vega, the great Spanish playwright. He's, usually considered as this kind of, quite far away from the learned world of his day, more interested in pleasantries and women and the theater as a mass medium. But he did code switch between Latin and the vernacular because some of the ideas and some of the sources that he wanted to draw on were just available in Latin, and he was able to do that. People were able to switch between languages without translation. Very few texts were actually translated, but people did read a lot in other languages, be it Latin, be it another vernacular. So this was quite a common practice, and I'm quite a fan of this kind of practice that you don't have to have perfect Italian, but you're able to read a sonnet by Petrarch because reading is one of the four competencies that we teach nowadays. And you're strong in reading, but you couldn't write one yourself. So this kind of differentiation between capabilities is something that plays a major role there.
I like that a lot. I suggest to the students at the beginning of the course when I talk about this, that we're all strangers in Romance studies,
Yeah.
and that
Yeah.
that's somehow again an advantage. And maybe Latin maybe functioned in the same way in the in the early modern period. No one was there's a dead language, as you say. Everyone was speaking a second language, and maybe Romance studies does something of that today. I wonder, we're almost out of time, and maybe this is a bit of a leap, but I know you are interested in these things. I wonder how that notion is affected by what at least appears to be the infinite translatability offered by, for instance, artificial intelligence and so on and so
Yeah.
forth.
I think there's a lot of a lot of, devices are out there nowadays that would help translate text if we need that at any point. But I'm a huge fan of trying to explore texts in the original, maybe using a translation as a kind of a, a crutch, if that's an appropriate metaphor, just to, help finding one's way in a text. But in terms of what Roman studies teaches us of this kind of interconnectedness of texts, of being deterritorialized, being a stranger, why not explore this being a stranger to a text and a culture a little more and just be a bit daring, just try to do something with a text if you're not fully competent. When are we ever fully competent to read a text? I feel to encourage our students to rely on their ability. If they have one Romance languages, why not try to read something in the next Romance language? Because I mean, chances are that you will get a grasp of a lot of things. And then why not use a translation to help you along, but never leave the original behind? So this would be a pedagogical aspect that I think is really important to move away from this dependency on translation. And of course, I mean, this kind of lazy AI culture that is emerging right now, I feel we should resist a little bit more.
That's a beautiful place to end. I love that call to students to risk, to dare, to again, to be a stranger, to be go beyond their level of competence, perhaps. Also because you see things that are perhaps taken for granted by those who are already familiar with those worlds, with those languages, and so on. Professor Anita Traninger, thank you so much for this conversation.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.